Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar, Major Trends in State and Federal Anti-Hunger Policy. We will be getting started in just a couple minutes. We're going to give any latecomers a second to come on, and we'll get started in a few. Thank you. Hello again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at this webinar. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping announcements. My name is Emily Gartenberg, and we're so happy you could join us. Throughout this webinar, we will keep everyone on mute, but there is a chat function. It's called the questions box that should be on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have a question throughout the webinar, go ahead and chat it into the questions box, and we'll have some chances to discuss those questions throughout the webinar. We'll be starting with state policy trends, and we'll break for state questions, and then we'll go into federal policy, and we'll break again for any federal questions. After the webinar, we will be sending out the slide deck. It has hyperlinks that you can click on if you're interested following the webinar. And now, without any further ado, I'm going to turn it on to my colleague, Bernadette Downey.
Hi there, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so thrilled to be able to talk to you today about some of the trends happening in the states across the country. My name is Bernadette Downey. I'm Associate Director for Government Relations and Advocacy at Share Our Strength, and I'll be joined by my colleague, Asubulu Dadi, in just a second. I'm going to open us up with a conversation about some of the specific advocacy campaigns that No Kid Hungry was directly working on during the 2019 legislative session. So that means starting from January this year, there were a few that did carry over from last year, but that's basically the time period that we're going to be talking about today. And then Asubulu, I will turn it over to him, and he's going to talk about some of a little bit more of those policies in detail and some of the broader trends that we've been observing across the country when it comes to how the state legislatures are tackling issues related to child hunger, the federal child nutrition programs, and other federal nutrition programs in general. So if we want, we can get started with the first slide, or obviously that was the agenda for today, so we're gonna just jump right in. Okay. So as I mentioned, in 2019, we worked specifically with several of our No Kid Hungry campaigns on advancing their advocacy goals that were throughout the country. And the states in orange are representing all of the different states that we were working in this year. There are 10 states, and they really took on a variety of different types of policies, from ranging from state budget items to introducing brand new pieces of legislation, and working with governors' offices to advance some of their own proposals and initiatives in various places. And some also were working on policies that we have worked on before that are renewing and making sure that those programs and policies either were re-upped or reinvested in for a new legislative year. Next slide. So first, let's start with some of the great news that we had that was a result of this past legislative session. Of the states that I just indicated, we had several really significant victories this year that we're thrilled to be a part of. All of these campaigns are really led by phenomenal advocates on the ground. We are thrilled to partner with various different coalitions and advocacy organizations, and are so grateful that they welcome us as part of those conversations so we can help advance these issues for kids across the country. I'll start with just kind of giving a little bit of detail. High level, we don't have a ton of time here today, so I'm just going to give you a high level view of what these were. Again, Asubulu is going to cover some more in-depth information, but again, we have a Q&A session coming up, and we welcome you to also follow up afterwards with specific details as you see. In California, we were thrilled that the legislature there re-upped a grant program for the California Department of Education to distribute $500,000 to school districts for the use for breakfast after the bell programming. This was really exciting and a lot of work from a multitude of advocates on the ground in California. So we were thrilled to see that that program was reinstated there. It's going to have a big impact, of course. Going over to Maryland, this is one of the more exciting pieces of legislation. Most of what you'll hear me discuss relates to school breakfast. As most of you know, the school breakfast policies that are out there are most prevalent. There's the most legislative precedent for those across the country. And frankly, with the ongoing conversations in Capitol Hill on the summer meals program, there hasn't been that many opportunities that we've seen in the recent past to legislate related to the summer meals program and connecting more kids there. So we were really thrilled that out of Maryland, an innovative new policy was passed by the legislature this spring. It is called Summer SNAP for Children, and it more or less models the USDA summer EBT pilots that have been ongoing at the federal level. And we really see this as the first time that a state has taken it upon itself to say that they want to try to model this type of program and reach kids who aren't served by traditional summer meals sites. The measure appropriated $200,000 to support this program, and it is going to be based on an application-based system that counties throughout the state will apply to the Department of Human Services. And once selected, they will be asked to match the amount of funding that is allocated to them in order to serve their constituents. And the amounts that will be awarded to children who are current SNAP users is going to be an additional $30 per month in the summer months, so for over 3 months in the summer, with an additional $10 offered to children in the SNAP program who are selected by their counties during winter break. So making sure to cover that crucial out of school time period as well. So it's going to be interesting to watch this unfold, and we're really eager to see if this is something that other states choose to take up this year. In Maine, I will cover, there was 4 really exciting pieces of legislation that we were so thrilled to see passed that are going to make sure that more kids are being fed in multiple different programs this year. One of the main pieces of legislation made sure that there would be an online free or reduced priced meal application available to residents of Maine. They also eliminated the reduced price category. Also, in terms of innovative and exciting new policy, they have passed a requirement for schools with 50% or more free or reduced priced eligible children to be serving the after school meals program. And they've also helped to streamline the after school meals application as well. And then finally, following the trend of many states, about 10 other states in the country, they have passed a measure that will fund and support the expansion of breakfast after the bell for the same amount of high need schools, those with kids at 50% or more free or reduced priced eligibility. It will require schools that meet that threshold to serve breakfast after the bell. There are a few technical corrections that are needed related to that particular measure. So based on a couple last minute drafting errors that happen in the process. So we are going back and going to make sure that that legislative intent is maintained and carried forward as this moves forward for towards regulations and the next steps of the process there. In New York City, initially not, if you may have noticed, was not part of our original list of campaigns this year, but during the budget conversations that were held in New York City, we were successful in getting cuts to the Breakfast After the Bell program there, rolled back. Initially, $6 million were proposed to be cut from the Breakfast After the Bell program in the city, and those were restored in the final version of the city budget. So we were thrilled to see that as well. And then in Ohio, one of the more recent pieces of legislation to be passed in their state budget, they have passed legislation which is going to really direct the State Department of Education to develop strategies for high-need schools and making sure that they are serving breakfast to students before or during the school day, and really tracking and reporting back to the General Assembly and Governor on the participation rates in those schools and making them publicly available through their department website. So we're excited to see some clarity being brought to the state education data on school breakfast, and are looking forward to seeing kind of what that can tell us about participation rates and where we go from here as a state. And then finally, actually I have two more, but I think the big exciting piece of legislation to pass out of Oregon is the Student Success Act, which was a sweeping measure of in Oregon covering the entire education spectrum, including the nutrition areas. And so as part of this big piece of legislation, which we are still digging into the ultimate impact of what this will be, but they have passed another Breakfast After the Bell requirement for schools that are 70% free or reduced priced eligible children or above. And they will also be serving those meals for free as a requirement as part of that legislation. There will be grants given to the schools that are impacted by that requirement throughout the state. I think that it's about a $5,000 grant. And then in addition, they also are looking at CEP and how to ensure that more schools are taking up CEP. So they have allocated that resources should be given to schools to help cover some of the cost differences between electing CEP and what the reimbursement structure is, as well as expanding the income eligibility for families to 300% of the federal poverty line, which mirrors their Medicaid enrollment numbers. And I think the goal there is to make sure that children aren't being, schools aren't being, they're not losing children to count towards their ISP numbers, which is really exciting and innovative. And we think this is going to have really far-reaching impact in Oregon, with thousands of children will be benefiting from it. There was a ballot initiative that was proposed, and at this point in time, from what we understand, that has been suspended. So we are continuing to watch for that, though, and I'm sure the advocacy community will mobilize as required if that is taken up again. And then finally, in Virginia, as many of you know, the last several years, the state of Virginia has had a program to incentivize school breakfast participation. That funding was renewed for that program in the midst of a very busy budget cycle. Next slide. And so just really quickly, and I will cover something, and actually I just got a question sent over to me. For those who are not familiar, CEP stands for the Community Eligibility Provision. It is a provision that allows schools or school districts, based on the identified student percentage of their student body who are identified as low income, to be qualified for free meals universally for their school if they have elected and so applied for CEP designation. And so I have Subalu who can go into even more technical details on that if you are interested, but it is an extraordinarily important piece of the puzzle, which allows us to make sure that as many kids as possible are participating. It relieves a lot of the red tape and bureaucratic issues that schools have with regards to tracking students and their participation in the federal programs, whether they're identifiers, et cetera. And it's especially effective when you do couple it with a breakfast after the bell program, making sure that, while kids don't have to worry about paying for meals because those are covered as a school, they also are receiving them in the most efficient way possible. So we see great rates of participation increase when coupled together. Great question. And again, if you want more clarification, feel free to chat that in and we can have folks chime in a second. So in 2019, we did have a couple of those states from the outset that were not successful. In Montana, this was something that we were working on with our No Kid Hungry campaign there, really actually looking to just bring some modest amount of funding to schools to support their expansion of the school breakfast program in general. Many times we try to target our programs to reinforce and support breakfast after the bell, which, as many of you know, is the most effective way of connecting kids to school breakfast. In Montana, we were looking just at breakfast in general. We also were looking at a measure that would have supported farm to school. And it was a very new idea, and so we got some great reception. Unfortunately, it did not pass, but we're going to reevaluate and think closely and talk with many of the folks on the ground to see what makes sense for the next legislative session in 2021. In Minnesota, there was also a wonderful state coalition that was working to expand the funding support for schools that could choose to do breakfast after the bell. It unfortunately was making its way through the budget process, but did not end up through the final version. It was an extra reimbursement that would have incentivized schools for this. We are really excited. I think there's a lot of potential here, and I know that the advocates in the state are really eager to continue to push forward, and hopefully we'll revisit this policy and maybe some others as we move forward in the future. They are one of the states that had a new administration in the past year as well, so it's been wonderful to get to know all of the new leadership and folks in the state there. And then in Rhode Island, the governor of Rhode Island, Governor Gina Raimondo, had proposed in January a No Student Hungry initiative. And in that initiative, she requested some small amount of funds to support 3 different pillars. One, looking at college student hunger and trying to increase accessibility to work programs so that way more students would qualify for a SNAP. The other 2 components were related to the child nutrition programs, and those programs were to require CEP participation in eligible schools. Again, that program I just described, when schools were eligible, making sure that they were actually using it. And then the other piece of that was a breakfast after the bell requirement, modeled similarly like the many that are across the state, or across the country rather. And I know I'm running short on time, so let's go to the next slide quickly. Very quickly, so in Massachusetts, again, that was on the beginning. This is a piece of legislation. The Rise and Shine Coalition has been working doggedly on passing a breakfast after the bell requirement for high need schools in Massachusetts over the last almost 2 years. Massachusetts has year-round sessions, and so the conversation we got through last session, and unfortunately the bill did not pass, but it was reintroduced this January, and we have reinvigorated the conversation around this issue as advocates in the state have been doing a tremendous job, a tremendous amount of work there. There was a recent hearing in June, and we were pleased to participate in that, but we are eager to get this hopefully completed and signed into law this year or maybe next. Next slide. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to Asubelu now.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us again. My name is Asubelu Dadi, and I'm Senior Manager of Policy Analysis at Share Our Strength. My presentation is going to focus on, sharing some of, the federal and state level policy trends and legislative and policy trends. And I'm going to discuss the policy trends in 2 contexts: at the state level I will focus predominantly on school nutrition programs, but I will also touch base on SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and also some of the child hunger and poverty-related bills introduced across states. And at the federal level, I'm going to briefly indicate some of the regulatory trends that we have seen recently, particularly in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, specifically the Broad-Based Categorical Eligibility and the public charge rule, and also some of poverty-related regulations, which is the CHAIN CPI, or the Consumer Price Index related regulation, which is related with the official poverty measure. And then I'm also going to briefly mention the Child Nutrition Reauthorization. I'm not going to discuss on the details of them because my colleague Jason Gormley will discuss them in detail, but I will briefly, discuss the implication of some of these regulatory initiatives. So at the state level, before going to the trends, I would like to say 3 points. Number one is, as I'm going to discuss the state policy trends, I would like to say that not all of these bills or policies are enacted, but most of them, but not all of them. And considering time, I may not be going too detailed, but I will try to give as much context and detailed information as possible. And the third point that I would like to say is, as far as the state level policy and legislative trend is concerned, most of them will have a very dramatic positive impact in terms of increasing access to and participation in the school nutrition programs. But at the same time, when you look at the federal side of the trends, they will have a negative implication in terms of improving access and participation in the federal nutrition programs more generally. So I will discuss more of them later in the presentation. So next slide. In the school breakfast area, I'm going to demonstrate or discuss 6 major policy trends, specifically in the school breakfast program area. And number 1 would be a breakfast after the bell, and second would be the state incentive funding to improve for breakfast after the bell, which is intended to increase access and participation in the school breakfast program area. The third policy trend looks elimination of the reduced price for both school breakfast and lunch, and in some states it could be only for school breakfast. And the fourth policy trend is going to be the unpaid school meal dates, and then the fifth would be regarding the policies and legislatives regarding the community eligibility provision, and the sixth would be farm to school. So these are the 6 major trends that I'm going to focus on in the school breakfast area. So breakfast after the bell, as we know, is one of the most effective and strategy to increase access to and participation in the school breakfast program area. And as Bernard already indicated, thus far we have 12 states that enacted a statewide breakfast after the bell legislation, including Maine and Oregon. So when you look at the examples that I provided here, there are 8 states, and out of these 8 states, if I categorize them by group, I would say that 6 of them require schools above a certain threshold, rent reduced price threshold, to implement breakfast after the bell, and some of them they don't require but encourage or provide incentive funding to implement breakfast after the bell, so that more kids will have access to the school breakfast program. So the example of some of the states that require includes Maine, Oregon, Missouri, and then Ohio, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. They require a breakfast after the bell, and Minnesota and Montana, incentivize schools to implement these innovative and effective strategies to increase access to and participation in the school breakfast program area. So of these 8 states, I would say Ohio, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island require schools to implement breakfast after the bell in their state budget, while Maine, Oregon, and Missouri require schools to implement breakfast after the bell in a standard legislation. So that's the kind of the bigger picture in terms of the way how states are approaching, in terms of requiring their respective schools and the school districts to implement the breakfast after the bell program. So if we look at the specific trends, I mean, in terms of, Maine, for example, requires schools with 50% and above free and reduced price meals to implement breakfast after the bell. But Oregon, when you look at the Oregon context, it requires schools with 70% and above free and reduced price meals. And then the same is true in, I would say, in Rhode Island, 70% and above. Massachusetts, it's 60% and plus free and reduced price eligibility context. So those are, the broader context or the way how states are approaching in requiring schools to implement breakfast after the bell. In terms of incentive funding, I would say in Minnesota, it encourages schools, but it doesn't require them to implement. But if you look at Montana, it provides a per meal reimbursement so that schools can, encourage and, and implement the program. So that looks, the major, trends that we see in the school breakfast context as far as breakfast after the bell is concerned. And the second context would be the incentive funding for breakfast after the bell. Then the examples that I can provide, which Bernard also mentioned, is Virginia. We have in California, and then the District of Columbia under Healthy School Act. In terms of the DC context, for example, the Healthy School Act has been there, or it was first passed in 2010, and it is one of the most comprehensive piece of legislation. And then it requires already free breakfast for all students for all meals, and it also requires breakfast in the classroom at elementary schools, but also high school and middle schools by providing alternative strategies to implement or to serve breakfast. And then it also eliminates the reduced price. That's already there. But what is new in the 2019 legislation is it's amended in the legislation by adding annual subsidy for schools to implement innovative breakfast models, which includes breakfast in the classroom or grab and go and second chance breakfast. And to that end, the state provides $2 per student to public schools that are planning or that they are interested to implement these innovative models. And then in Virginia context, the state has been providing per meal reimbursement for schools with 45% and above since the last several years. And again, this has continued in the current legislation. And then in the California context, as already mentioned, $500,000 is provided by the state for schools, particularly prioritizing schools with 60% and above free and reduced price, so that they can start up or expand breakfast after the bell implementation in their schools and jurisdictions. So those are the two trends. And the third trend or element is the elimination of the reduced price meal category. And in this specific policy context, there are around 4 that I provided as an example here. New Hampshire, Maine, and New York, they effectively enacted legislation, and Nebraska is still, the legislation didn't make it, but I think that's also the state that, sought to eliminate the reduced price for both lunch and breakfast. In New Hampshire, it is for school breakfast, kids who are required normally to pay for the reduced price meal, now they are not required to do for the school breakfast program, and that would definitely reduce the financial burden on low-income families, and it would make access to the school breakfast program much easier. In the context of Maine, Maine already has a bill that would make elimination of the reduced price, for school breakfast, but what is new in the current budget is it's eliminated the reduced price lunch as well. So that would definitely, support, low-income families and children in Maine to have access to both school breakfast and lunch, and reduce the financial burden as well. In the New York context, it is for both school breakfast and lunch, and the state also provided $2.3 million to cover the cost of providing those meals for free for the kids that otherwise would have been required to pay for the reduced price breakfast and lunch. So that's the broader trend in the as far as elimination of the reduced price is concerned. The next one would be the unpaid meal days. Regarding those kind of policies, I would say that this has been, the trend as well last year. A number of states have introduced legislation trying to address the consequence of, those, unpaid meals that's having implication on the school budget, but at the same time, the negative consequence on children. So as we already know, almost 75% of school districts across the country are grappling with the issue of unpaid meal days issues, and according to the School Nutrition Association report last year. And this trend that we see both last year and current year is a pure reflection of the state's interest to try to address the issue in one way or another. So one of the common themes that we can see across all these states that I provided as an example here in Arizona, in Illinois, Maine, Montana, and New Jersey, and all the other states is that they try to make sure that kids are not, discriminated or, singled out for the fact that they couldn't or they can't pay for their meal days. So all of them, they clearly make it clear that, kids shouldn't be ashamed or discriminated for the fact that they have this unpaid meal context or account in their school meal. So that's, I think, a very, common message. And as I said earlier, it's a pure reflection of states, interest to try to make sure that, kids shouldn't be, ashamed for the fact that they can't pay for their meals. The fifth trend that I'm trying to be fast in that context, mindful of time. So I'm going to the next one, which is the community eligibility provision. Just to say that this, the community eligibility provision is a federal provision that would allow schools with high proportion of kids that are eligible, that are like high poverty schools, which means 40% and above, to be able to provide free meals at no cost for all kids. And I think the significant benefit of this policy is it would reduce burden on schools because they are not required to collect, application from those kids that otherwise would have to file, the fact that they are, to demonstrate their eligibility for free or paid meals. So this will have an administrative efficiency implication on school, on the schools, and it will also at the same time avoid both the unpaid meal issue and at the same time reduces the discrimination element that kids shouldn't be discriminated for the fact that they can't pay their meal. And it will also contribute to improving access in the school breakfast program area and including school lunch. So a number of states are introducing legislation or have introduced in the current legislation. Oregon, Rhode Island, Washington, and Texas, and including California, have introduced different legislations with the same kind of approach. But when you look at the details of each legislation, there is one common element, which is to make sure that schools that are eligible or that are qualified to provide or implement this, the CEP program should do it, or for the fact that one, it would eliminate reduce the unpaid meal day context. Second thing, it would ensure administrative efficiency and save money for the school budget, and at the same time, and then it would make sure that kids have access to meals. So if I give example, for example, the context in Washington State, what the legislation specifically do is it requires the Office of Public Instruction to develop and implement a plan to increase the number of schools that are, participating in CEP. And it is, going to do that, one, by, requiring the Office of Public Instruction to identify and recruit eligible schools to implement CEP. And then at the same time, working in collaboration with the community-based organizations, national organizations that are focused on, eradicating childhood hunger and poverty, in the process of identifying those kind of schools. So there is, the Office of Public Instruction, which is a state agency in the context of Washington State, that is also required to prepare annual reports that will evaluate any barriers to implementation of CEP across the schools and jurisdictions that are required or that are eligible to implement this program. So this legislation, even though it doesn't specifically state like X number of schools should implement CEP, it does rather provide the framework by which schools could be able to implement this program by addressing their specific concerns and specific barriers to implement the program. So I think, the same is true in Texas. I would say they follow the same trend or similar type of approach, and then I would be happy to provide more details. I think if folks are interested in terms of how states are doing it or approaching it in the context. The sixth context or trend I would say in the school breakfast is the farm to school, and this again is another innovative. I would say I think a number of states have been implementing it, and in the current legislation we have seen Montana, Colorado, Minnesota, Virginia, and other states implementing it. I think the whole goal of it is to make sure that kids have healthy or access to healthy meals, which is locally produced meals, and at the same time the benefit of it is not only for the children but for the local economy as well. So that's another major trend. It has been there, and it's continued. A number of states have continued to implement it. Slide. The last one I would say briefly mention about is the child hunger and poverty reduction related legislations. I think a number of states again, with a view to end hunger and food insecurity and malnutrition in their specific states, they have introduced either a resolution or a legislation to make sure that that is their higher priority. That kids will have the opportunity or the chance to grow healthy and achieve their full potential. So all of these states in California or Illinois, Iowa, Maryland, a number of them introduced different type of legislations, but the whole focus or purpose of it would be to eradicate or remove obstacles that would otherwise increase the risk of food insecurity and poverty for children. So the last one on this context, the next, I think, major. I'm just moving away from now from. No, sorry, can you go back on? Yeah. So before going to the supplemental nutrition assistance program, I would like to mention briefly about the summer meal program area, some of the trends in the summer and after school meal program area. So I think Bernadette already mentioned this, so I may not be spending too much time on that, but this is one of the most, I think, innovative legislative approach in Maryland in trying to tackle, summer hunger or food insecurity. So that's, there are federal pilots before, but this is, state-led initiative in trying to address the, summer food insecurity and hunger in the state of Maryland. So I think a number of states have tried to do different approach last year, particularly requiring, certain type of schools that are located in a, with 50% above free and reduced price range, and then this year it looks a little bit different approach. So I think this is one major trend I would mention in this context. And the other one in the after-school meal program area is the state of Maine is requiring schools that are 50% and above free and reduced price to participate in the CHFP program. And then offer after school meal for at-risk students, and this is I think one of the first legislations that I've seen, and with a view to address out of school related hunger. So those three, the one that I mentioned in the school breakfast, summer and after school, are more focused on the child nutrition program areas. But as far as the SNAP program is concerned, I think I may not be, spending too much time, but I guess for sake of time, but there are certain type of, policies introduced across the states that would restrict or, access to the supplemental nutrition program, particularly, bills related with work requirements for able-bodied adults without dependents, and so those kind of bills have been introduced in Alabama and Kentucky. And then also in Illinois as well, and all the kind of policies regarding photo ID requirements or drug testing for potential applicants to SNAP, and also even the TANF and other related safety programs. So this kind of trend that we see at the state level, but I think none of them have enacted these legislations. So, but I think it is really reflects how these kind of policy initiatives might have implication in terms of reducing not only access to SNAP, but also programs that have direct connection with the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which includes the school meals. So that would be, I think, my focus on the state level. And that's just to briefly mention, as I said at the beginning, I may not be discussing the details on the federal level trends, but I would like to flag, or I would like to highlight that there are certain type of regulatory initiatives recently that we see. Some of them would target the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Some of them would target, for example, the public charge rule would have implications beyond nutrition programs, including, it would have the effect of, restricting access to not only SNAP, but also a range of programs that are, directly connected with the school meal program. As an example, the point that I would like to flag in this context is these three, the regulatory approach in the SNAP, which is the Broad-Based Categorical Eligibility, or the public charge rule, or even the Chain CPI, which is, the Chain CPI is sort of inflation measure that would adapt a much slower, inflation measure to official poverty measures, which means programs that are dependent on or that use the official poverty measure to, determine eligibility, will have a much lower or fewer people to participate in those kind of programs. So the whole thing is all of these, the three trends, the SNAP, the public charge, and the Chain CPI. The common theme of them is that they will have a huge negative implication in terms of restricting access to vital nutrition programs, and also even beyond. So that is completely opposite to what we have seen in the state trends. The examples that we have seen in the Child Nutrition Program areas earlier, like in the school breakfast area, we try to expand access. With the opposite is at the federal level now, because the federal action that we see in this context would undercut efforts that are still taking to improve access. So that is just kind of very concerning, and I think my colleague would discuss more on those, including the Child Nutrition Reauthorization program. So I think with that, I would leave the next presentation to my colleague, but if you have any questions, happy to answer on those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asubelu. In the interest of time, we are going to skip the formal Q&A on the state trends, but at the beginning and end of this presentation, you have our contact information. So feel free to shoot anyone an email, and we'll be happy to get back to you. So with that, we're going to move on to some federal issues that are happening currently.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thank you to Asubelu and Bernadette as well. I am going to kind of speak through some of these things to make sure that y'all have an opportunity to ask a few questions here at the end of the federal issues. And while it may seem like there's a lot of news coming out of DC, but not a lot of action, I will say there is a lot going on at the federal level, both in Congress and through the rulemaking process with this administration. So I'm going to focus just on two legislative issues and then two rules from the administration that are going to have a really big impact on kids and families. So I want to start talking today about the expansion of access to summer EBT through the appropriations process and our strategy there. I also want to talk about the renegotiation of Child Nutrition Reauthorization, or CNR, that you've heard a little bit about already. And then I'm going to talk about two rules that the administration has been moving forward with. The first one on broad-based categorical eligibility, and the second on the public charge rule. And the first, the broad-based categorical eligibility, is still a proposed rule. Public charge is a final rule, so we're going to talk about the implications of that as well. So let's start with talking about summer EBT. So what is it? Summer EBT was started in 2011 as a demonstration project in 5 states, where it provided additional resources, some more money to families' EBT cards during the summer months to offset the loss of school meals for their kids. And it was wildly successful. It was a much appreciated flexibility and program in the states where it was being operated, and it quickly expanded to some additional communities, and to date has served about 250,000 kids. But summer EBT is only a demonstration project, so it doesn't reach all of the kids that it could, especially in those rural and hard-to-reach communities that a lot of the other programs that are out there have difficulty getting access to, especially summer meals for those kids. And so when we think about how we can reach those hard-to-reach populations, summer EBT is a really good program and possibility, but it has a limited geographic reach and it has limited finances as well. So why does it matter? Right now, we're looking at a demonstration project that's, as I said, limited in reach, but we know that there are hundreds of thousands of additional kids who could benefit from the program. So we're looking at this from really two tracks. The first being additional resources and money through the appropriations process, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, but then also thinking about the possibilities through Child Nutrition Reauthorization to make this a permanent program, which I'll get to next. So when we're thinking about that additional appropriations for the summer EBT program, we were very successful in the House appropriations process. They moved through an additional $22 million for the summer EBT program in their appropriations package. That's on top of the $28 million funding level from the last fiscal year. So that brings us to a total of $50 million for the summer EBT program from the House. Now, that's enough to reach about 465,000 kids, a big increase over the 250,000 who have been reached to date, but it's only passed in through the House, and the Senate hasn't picked up and moved their appropriations bills yet. So we continue to apply pressure there to make sure that the Senate makes an increased investment in summer EBT to help those additional kids. The good news is we have a lot of bipartisan support on both sides of the Hill, and it's just a matter of making sure that this remains top of their priority list. So now moving on to Child Nutrition Reauthorization, which I'll put it this way, it's like the Super Bowl for child nutrition programs. It's the place where there's a lot of opportunity to move the needle and help hundreds of thousands of additional kids who are currently utilizing these programs and make sure that they have access as we go forward. So what is CNR? It's the federal law that sets the policy and funding for a bunch of different programs. It was first passed in 1966, and it's supposed to be reauthorized every 5 years. Now, as happens in Congress pretty frequently, negotiations didn't go as expected back in 2015 when it was due to be reauthorized. So we've been operating under the 2010 bill ever since then. And Chairman Roberts of the Senate, the Republican chairman of the Senate Ag Committee, has made this a priority to get it done. He kind of has a clock ticking because his term is up and he's not running for re-election at the end of next year. So he wants to get this done as kind of a capstone project for himself, and has been a big champion of a lot of these programs throughout his career. You also have Senator Stabenow, who is the ranking member on that committee, and she's working very hard to make sure that a lot of the policies and programs that we care about are protected as they move through that process. So when we think about CNR, it could be a really big vortex. There's a lot of changes and opportunities to move the needle on many different programs. So we're focusing our attention right now on the summer food service program and the ability to really make sure that we're taking that program, which reaches just a fraction of the kids that it needs to, and make the necessary changes in this reauthorization to reach as many kids as we possibly can, with a goal of improving those summer meals, but also thinking about how do we create bipartisan alliances that we can really tackle these issues in childhood hunger in meaningful ways over the long term. So using it as an opportunity to not only expand access to kids who qualify and make sure that they can get the meals that they need, especially during summer months, but also how can we make sure that over the long term we have cemented some relationships with leaders who can help us move the ball. So 3 policy priorities for CNR around summer, the first being permanent authorization of summer EBT. We talked about summer EBT and its importance a moment ago and how we're trying to move through the appropriations process to get additional resources into that program. But we also want to make sure that we're able to keep the program alive and well going forward, and that it's not at the whim of the Secretary of Agriculture to either move forward or cancel that program as a demonstration. So the appropriation that we're looking for, the additional $22 million, would enable us to stay in all of the states that are currently operating the program, but expand to additional states as well. But as we think about the second idea here, the second priority, improving the flexibility for non-congregate sites during the summer months, this is a way to reach more hungry kids in those rural and hard-to-reach areas where congregate sites just aren't working. They aren't a possibility due to transportation barriers, weather, due to a lot of different circumstances that those communities are facing. We want to make sure that we can reach as many kids as we possibly can in these places. The summer EBC program is not going to be a fit for everywhere, and the non-congregate sites are a way that we can just continue to chip away at that gap between the kids who are accessing free and reduced school meals and the kids who are able to access those summer meals as well. And then the last priority here is streamlining program requirements between the summer and after school programs to make sure that sites and states have the opportunity to operate these programs year round and don't have to jump back and forth between different program structures, reducing that overhead, reducing that administrative burden so that they can more effectively focus on what these kids need. So as I said, the Senate is kind of taking the lead on CNR here. We are working very closely with them and a lot of other anti-hunger advocacy organizations from around the country to make sure that all of these policies and priorities remain at the top of mind as they negotiate that package. And then the House is going to take a look after the Senate passes something. But I will say that this is a very packed calendar with a lot of things coming up, especially this fall. And then we have a presidential election looming for next year. So we've got to keep the pressure on if we want to make sure the Congress is taking the necessary steps to move everything forward. So how can you engage? I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because we'll send out the slides in a moment, but we just have to keep that drumbeat and the importance of these programs top of mind for members. And there are lots of different ways you can get engaged and involved. All of those hyperlinks up on your screen right there, links to different places on our website where you can just see our draft letters, our draft call scripts and things like that so that you can have the resources to tailor for your own needs. So the harmful rules, there's a lot here that I could delve into very deeply, and I know that Asublu could jump into it as well. I'm going to highlight some very high-level things here on broad-based categorical eligibility. Again, this is a proposed rule, so I just want to highlight that comments are still open. They are due to the USDA by September 23rd, and they can be submitted at www.regulations.gov. Basically, the big thing to know about BBCE is it allows states to align their eligibility for SNAP with their other anti-poverty programs. It helps individuals and families make sure that just because they have some modest assets, that they're not kicked out of the SNAP program, even though they're not able to cover the financial needs of their family. A family who qualifies for SNAP through BBCE must still meet all SNAP requirements, and they have to have a monthly net income below the 100% of the federal poverty line after you reduce things like housing and childcare and healthcare expenses. So this is an opportunity to eliminate that benefit cliff and make sure that more families and especially kids have access to the nutrition they need, especially as there are so many kids who are automatically enrolled in free and reduced school meals based on their family's SNAP eligibility in those schools that are using CEP certification. So what happens if the administration is successful? 3.1 million kids are going to get, or 3.1 million people are going to be ineligible for SNAP. That's mainly working families, seniors, and people with disabilities. It's also going to be about 500,000 kids are going to lose that direct certification for free meals. And frankly, CEP participating schools are also going to be hit because they may receive lower reimbursements or lose CEP eligibility altogether if there's a drop in kids being directly certified. There are a lot of implications on this, and we do encourage you to comment by the deadline. The second issue that is really top of mind for a lot of folks right now is the public charge rule. This is an immigration rule that is in its final stage. It goes into effect on October 15th. It is currently the way that the structure is, only cash assistance supports like TANF and SSI are taken into account when they're determining whether or not someone is eligible for admission or permanent residency in the United States. And then the other thing they're looking at is long-term institutionalized care paid for by Medicaid. Those are the only two things being taken into consideration right now. for those immigrant families. What is the administration trying to do? They're trying to vastly expand the list of benefits that they take into consideration when they are deciding whether or not somebody is a quote-unquote public charge and can be denied entry or permanent status here. And these are, the list is up there, but I'll call your attention to SNAP and Medicaid services. They're both included on there. And it's going to penalize those who are deemed more likely than not to become a public charge at any time in the future. So an immigration official is not just going to make a determination based on what you have done in the past, but they're going to take a prospective look and decide whether or not you may become a public charge at any time in the future. And that application or certification for that public benefit may be considered as evidence of potential future participation in a public benefit program for that test of whether you're likely to access and use those programs in the future. So how's it going to hurt families and communities? DHS themselves estimates that around 325,000 individuals are going to preemptively disenroll themselves or their families from or avoid enrolling in public benefits for which they otherwise qualify, just so that they can try to protect their immigration status and be able to stay in the country with their families, even if they have U.S. citizen children. And children who are directly certified for school meals through that SNAP participation especially are at risk of losing eligibility, and then the family must enroll the child separately in those programs. That doesn't count against their immigration status. So something that it's a nuance, but we want to make sure as the fear and concern really goes through these communities that we're paying attention to that. Families are going to see a decrease in disposable income, and it's going to force legal immigrant families to really choose between staying together as a family here in the United States or ensuring that their children and families have the nutrition and healthcare and stable housing that they need. So the final public charge rule, again, just going to emphasize, is not in effect until October 15th. So sorry, I know that was fast, but wanted to give you guys an opportunity for at least one question, Emily.
Great, thank you so much, Jason. And we do have a question on summer EBT. And the question is, what states currently have summer EBT?
Great, so summer EBT is a fantastic question. It's currently operational in Connecticut, Oregon, Delaware, Michigan, Missouri, Nevada, Virginia, Texas, Tennessee, and then in the Chickasaw and Cherokee nations, which are both in Oklahoma.
Great, and with that, we are just at time. So just as a reminder, we have all of our contact information linked here, as well as our best practices website that has a policy and advocacy section with a lot more of the resources that we discussed today. On behalf of all of us at Share Strength, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to chat with you again on a future webinar.